Hello everyone and welcome to another session of AP Human Geography with Mr. Elrod. Today, ladies and gentlemen, excuse me, in the South, we have issues with pollen, and apparently as I've gotten older, allergies have gotten worse, so excuse me for that. So once again, welcome everyone to another session of AP Human Geography with Mr. Elrod. So what I've decided with the AP exam only about a month away is to go through each of the units and provide you with a relatively brief overview of each unit. So when I say brief, the videos themselves will be kind of long because we're trying to cover each unit within one video, but the overview of the unit is going to be relatively brief. The purpose here is not necessarily to get into specific details about each unit, but rather I want to give you kind of a broad discussion of the really important topics that are found within each unit, the important models, the important ideas, so that way you can refresh your memory. You can kind of zip around and look at some different things so that hopefully you can make the most effective time of your review. So I hope you find these helpful. I'll hopefully address most of the topics that you need covered, and then certainly hopefully you do well on the Human Geography exam later this year. So to start off with, the discussion in the course as we begin is really very basic. The question is, well, what exactly are we studying in human geography? Now, human geography is a little bit different from normal studies of geography in that the primary focus of human geography is going to be a focus on humans. So really, as we go throughout the course, the idea is to focus on humans and the space that they exist in. And so we're going to ask ourselves a couple of questions. The most important really of which is, how is it that humans interact with their space, and how do they do that differently? I generally talk about it both across time and across space. And so how is that going to look different as we go from place to place to place? So we're not necessarily studying just the physical formations, but we're mostly concerned with studying people and the space that they live in and how they interact with that space. Geography talks about creating this idea of what's called spatial perspective. Not just understanding what is happening, and not even really just understanding where it is happening, but really understanding kind of the why element to that. I guess I have it written here, not just the what or the why, which is kind of more of a history thing, but then inserting the where into that. So I guess I should correct myself there. The way that I've seen it put, and you can actually find this in an article on the Human Geography portion of the of AP Central, is framed in the form of a question, and that is, what is there, why there, and why care? So if you think about those three elements as you go throughout the course, what is where, why there, why care, it really helps you to kind of encapsulate the principles of human geography as you go throughout the entirety of the course. And no matter what you're studying, you can ask yourself, what is there? Why is it there, and then why should I care about it, really, which is the synthesis portion of the class. So when we talk about geographers, and we talk about what it is that geographers do, and this idea of space, is there's a couple of different things that geographers are looking for. Number one, they want to understand the impact of people on their space. They want to understand to what extent do people impact their space. They also want to understand what is the impact that space has on people. We know that different people across the world interact with each other, and they interact with their space differently. And so the geographers want to know, well, what is it maybe about that space that is going to cause people to interact with it a little bit differently across the world. And then the last part is, how is it that people themselves interact with each other within that space? So again, this understanding of not just understanding what is happening and why it's happening, but also understanding the where element of that, and understanding how space is going to play an important role in our understanding of different events. So when we look at geographers and the different methods that they use, so obviously we're talking about studying space, so we need to ask ourselves, well, how is it that they're going to go about studying the space? And obviously that's important. The main thing that geographers are going to do is they're going to go about collecting data, and they do this in a couple of different ways. A lot of times geographers will simply go to databases, and so you have field geographers and you have others, but a lot of times you just simply go to a database, because really collecting the data can be some of the most difficult part of the process. And so there are a variety of databases around, and you can access various databases online. So governments will oftentimes put up databases. Think about the U.S. Census Bureau, the U.S. government. The U.S. Census Bureau is a part of the U.S. government. They collect a lot of data on U.S. population and movement, things like that. The United Nations collects a tremendous amount of data. That's how they deal with things like the Millennium Development Goals and things along those lines. They track that data to see how exactly things are going towards those ends. And other organizations like the World Health Organization is going to collect data. You can go to their website and you can check out some of the various data that they have. The International Monetary Fund is going to have various points of data that you can go to, and those all contain databases. So I'm looking for specific sets of information. I collect that information. There is the element in which geographers can go out there and collect it themselves, but like I said, a lot of times that's really an extensive portion. So it's a lot of times it's easier just to go to the databases. There is what's called qualitative research. We're not necessarily worried about that right now. This right here, what I'm talking about with databases, is what's considered quantitative research. Now, geographers are not done when they just simply collect the data. Again, geographers want to create spatial perspective, so the way that they do that is they then take that information and then they display it on a map. Okay, and so we're going to talk about different types of maps, but that's the whole idea is we want to take the data, because geographers deal with this idea that the information and data just in a chart or a graph or something like that is not necessarily as informative as if I can put it in space to help you understand not just what is happening, but where it's happening, to begin to understand kind of the bigger picture of the events that are taking place. Like I said, we'll look at some of those examples as we go forward and as we move on. So we're going to use those maps as in order to create a spatial perspective for you. So, like for instance, here's a map that I have, and I must have forgotten that I had this particular one. In fact, I show this particular map very early on in the school year as I'm trying to describe, especially the process of globalization to my students here. But you see the data that is presented on this particular map. We've got Starbucks and we've got McDonald's. And the maps are really talking to us about two different things. So the Starbucks map is talking to us about where is it that Starbucks gets their materials from. Okay, so you've got the paper products, you've got the sugar, you've got the coffee beans. And so, again, we could put this on just a piece of paper, and we could tell you the different countries that Starbucks gets its coffee from. But in terms of talking about globalization, global interactions in terms of trade, movement of goods, it's not nearly as impactful as if you put it on the map and you begin to understand from how far away all of these different resources come in order to make your morning Starbucks cup of coffee. And then the McDonald's the McDonald's map there is helping you to understand to what extent is McDonald's spread all over the world. So again, we could have the numbers up there in the different countries, but you can see using the map there, you get kind of a better sense of proportionality in terms of where McDonald's is and how many are there in comparison to different parts of the world. And I can glance across the map very quickly and see that McDonald's is much more likely to be in a certain part of the world than the other. And this is what happens when you have automatic lights in a classroom. The lights go off. I have to stand up now and go turn on the lights. I'll be right back. It's the difficulty of living in a energy conscious and technologically advanced community. So we've been talking about this idea of studying space. So the question then is, well, what is it exactly that we do in order to go about studying space? Well, within geography, we have this thing called the 5 themes of geography. I've also heard it discussed as the 5 themes of spatial perspective. But anyway, so what we're going to do is we're going to run through each of these 5 themes of geography. And again, I'm just going to kind of give you a brief idea of what they are and the different elements of them. I have other videos that go more in depth, so if you want to check those out, you're more than welcome to go check those out on the channel. So the 5 themes of geography are these. You have location, human environment interaction, region, place, and movement. All right, so when we talk about location, there are really 2 different ways to describe location. You have absolute location, and then you have what's called relative location. Generally, within the context of geography, relative location is going to be something more that geographers are concerned with because of the idea of this notion of relationship. Now, obviously, being able to pinpoint things on the Earth's surface, that's significant. Geographers want to understand space, but in terms of the analysis portion, the idea of relative location, where something is in relationship to something else, that is really going to be more the focus of the course because we're not just concerned about, well, where something is, but we want to understand the interaction of the thing within that space and how it interacts with the things around it. Okay, so a lot of times relative location is going to be more significant for us as we go through the course. We talk about the different ways to describe a location. Mostly we talk in terms of either site or situation, so site factors and situation factors. They should be really simple. Sometimes students get them confused with other ideas. But all site is simply what's going on in that space. If I'm talking about a particular space, what is there? If I'm talking about a particular city, New York City, what can I find in New York City? What kind of people are there? What kind of buildings are there? The street names, the types of businesses, those kinds of things. Situation is more along the lines of relative location, in that I'm looking for where is something in relationship to something else, and why is that significant? So what is it about the things around that space that are going to help me to better understand the space that I'm looking at? So if I talk about New York City again, this idea of understanding the position of New York City as it relates to the Hudson River, as it relates to the Atlantic Ocean, the harbor that's there, all those other kinds of things, and really understanding the significance of that place in relationship to the things around it and help it to become more important. So a couple of examples just to help us see the idea a little bit better. So this first image here we have these. You could look at this and discuss some site factors. Okay, so this is in the Andes Mountains in Argentina. Not that you would know that. That's just where the image comes from. So you have the Andes Mountains in the background. You have the horses in the foreground. And those could be some different site factors as we talk about Argentina. We talk about the physical environment. We talk about the flora and the fauna that are there. Obviously, there's no people in the picture. Now, an interesting element of this, if we talk about globalization, your question could be, well, I know that horses didn't originate in Argentina, so how in the world did they get to Argentina? Okay, and certainly horses are now pretty well ingrained in the Argentinian culture, the Spanish culture of South America. So that would be an interesting discussion, but again, this is just simply discussing site factors. The next couple of images that we have, so this first one, I was already mentioning New York City, and maybe I just got a little ahead of myself. But again, understanding New York City as it relates to other things around it, and what's going to make that significant. If I look at something, and now this is a couple of years old, but you had the situation in Crimea and Ukraine a couple of years ago with Russia invading Crimea, and so if you look at Ukraine and understanding the situation there, you really can't understand the political situation in Ukraine without understanding Ukraine's relationship or its situation in relationship to Russia. And this map presents that pretty well because we're talking about identification of ethnic groups within a country, and then, of course, that's going to be impacted directly by the geographic proximity to another state. Okay, and so this helps you to get a better understanding of Ukraine, its situation politically, its situation culturally, and then why we might have some of the events that we had transpire over the last couple of years in that country. So that's really the difference between site and situation. Again, shouldn't be that complicated, but hopefully that helps. So the next topic within the 5 themes of geography is human-environment interaction. Now, another term for human-environment interaction is going to be cultural ecology. They both mean exactly the same thing. Basically, what we're looking at is to what extent do humans affect the environment, or to what extent does the environment affect humans? So really, we're looking at the interplay between humans and the environment. And then looking at how is that going to impact the people in that space, their behaviors, their actions, their technological development, the way that they situate themselves within the space. So again, you're always looking at the interplay between the two, and this can be seen in a variety of different ways. So that we don't necessarily get too bogged down in this, there are 3 different theories that you can see there. You have, and I generally think of them on a continuum. To one extreme, you're dealing with the environment is the dominant force, whereas in the other one, the culture is the dominant force. So those are environmental determinism, possibilism, and then cultural determinism. So between those 3, again, you kind of have you have some different extremes, and again, I can kind of think of them on a continuum. So environmental determinism basically says that the environment forces certain types of human development, and it will force people to behave in a certain kind of way, and it will force people to act in a certain kind of way in terms of the types of improvements that they make in terms of culture, in terms of types of decisions that they make in culture, in terms of housing, food, those kinds of things. You see here the idea there is that the environment is the dominant force. It is kind of exacting its influence over humans, and there's really nothing that you can do about it. Again, on our continuum, that's to one extreme end where the environment is the dominant force. In the middle is this idea of possibilism, this idea that certainly the environment provides some constraints. It's going to limit individuals based upon the resources that are available to them, things along those lines, the technology that's available to people. But humans, through their ingenuity, through the various technologies they develop themselves, through trade maybe, they're able to overcome some of the environmental barriers that might exist there, and so there is the possibility of overcoming some of the environmental conditions. And then the last one, which is to the other extreme, is this idea that the environment really doesn't play a role at all in affecting or impacting human development. Rather, it is the culture of the people. It is the way they perceive themselves. It is the way that they perceive the environment and what it's there for. Is the environment something to be worshipped? Is the environment something to be utilized as a natural resource and a tool for us to improve? Things along those lines. So that's the idea, is that instead of the environment being the dominant force, it is culture being the dominant force. And almost this idea that there are no limits or bounds to the different types of improvements that people can make based upon their own cultural, I would say cultural identity, but the things that their culture finds to be acceptable. Next, we move on to region. So the whole purpose of region in geography is simply to try and lump geographic areas together for study. Okay, we as humans in general are very interested in trying to categorize things, and that's exactly what regions is all about. Now, you have to note that regions are never static. They can change over time, and it's really based upon the type of information that you're trying to study. Again, I have other videos on regions. I'm not going to dive into it too deeply. I'm just going to talk to you about kind of the basic characteristics of each one. So you have three types. Please note that each type has two different names. So first is the formal or the uniform region. Second is the functional or the nodal region. And then third is the vernacular or perceptual region. So just to give you a brief definition, when we talk about the formal region, sometimes I like the alternative name for it because it helps us maybe understand just a little bit better. So the formal region is this idea that there is a geographic space that has some sort of unifying or uniform characteristic in it. And so whatever it happens to be, it is the same or similar across most of the space. So this can be either geographic in terms of topographical, environmental, or it can be cultural in terms of the people that are there. The second one, functional or nodal, is that the unifying force in a space is something that is kind of imposed on the landscape. So you've got something on the landscape that unifies the entire space. Now, please note that the formal or nodal region is going to always be something that is man-made. Man has put something on the Earth's surface, and it really is the only unifying force. Okay, we use that word nodal because it's like a point or a node of influence. And so that's going to be the functional or the nodal region. The last region is the perceptual or the vernacular region. This idea that there might be some unifying characteristics, but really perceptual vernacular is based upon outside perception of what a space is and what are the different things that are going to unify a space. So with perceptual vernacular region, it's really this idea that it's kind of left up to interpretation. It's left up to whatever it is that you think about the space and what are some of the things that you think unify the space. And so those are the three different types. Again, really they're just three different ways that we can classify geographic spaces. Please note that you can actually in the same space have functional, formal, and vernacular regions. Okay, and so it's not necessarily like one just exists in isolation, but those are the different ways that we unify so that we can study spaces depending on what our geographic study might be. All right, so the next one is place, and this is one that is kind of, I don't know, kind of nebulous and kind of feel good, as you might say. So the idea of place is this notion that each spot on the Earth's surface has unique characteristics, and those characteristics are both cultural as well as physical. And so really it's kind of the unique combination of those different features that give the place itself kind of its unique characteristics. A lot of times geographers will talk about the idea of sense of place, and so the idea is that what is it that you notice about a place? What is it that kind of logs into your mind about a particular place, and what makes you think of, what do you think of when you think of that space? And this, again, is going to be something that can be kind of highly personal as far as perception of that place. Obviously, there's some characteristics that you can't dispute in terms of the unique things that are there, but often those unique characteristics will create on you, an impression on you that help to give you this idea of sense of space. Next, we're going to talk about movement. So movement is significant because in geography, we're dealing with interaction. We're talking about this idea of spatial interaction. And so the only way that you can get interaction is going to be movement. And then, of course, during the school day, the bells also ring. So when we define movement, really what we're looking at is we're looking at how is it that different people, goods, ideas, things along those lines, how is it that they're moving between different spaces, but we're also looking at how is it those things move within space. And we really can find out a lot about either the spaces themselves or the spaces that are interacting based upon that movement. And so some of the things we're trying to identify that you see there is, number one, geographers are trying to understand the idea of spatial interaction. So we've talked about this idea of creating spatial perspective. Now we're looking at how is it that different spaces themselves interact with one another. And so you're looking at, there can be a variety of levels really. Number one is what kind of spaces are most likely to interact with one another, and then why might that be the case. There's a couple of technical ideas found within the idea of movement. So you have what's called friction of distance and distance decay. Don't get too necessarily wrapped up in kind of the technicalities of them. Just basically know the idea is what role does distance play in the interaction between places. So when you look at something like friction of distance, basically it's like the active effect that distance has on the interaction between places. So this idea that the further away you go from something, the less likely things are to interact. Then the idea of distance decay it's very similar, but it's the idea that there's a lessening effect. So one's like they're less likely to interact, and the other is the effect of something or a place or the influence is going to become less and less and less over a distance. Okay, and so I've always talked about like cause and effect. So friction of distance is like the cause, and then distance decay is like the effect of that particular situation. And you see that in a variety of ways, but also know how that's going to change depending on where you are in the world, as well as through time as technology improves, as communications improve, and those kinds of things. There's a variety of things going on there. There's another idea called space-time compression. When we talk about globalization, your teacher should really hone in on the idea of globalization and global interactions. But it's this idea that over time, what we're able to do is we're able to travel further distances in shorter periods of time. So that means is that interactions are much more likely. And so we talk about relative distances. Essentially, relative distances are shrinking a great deal. Absolute distance remains the same. The distance between 2 points doesn't change, but what happens is the ability to interact is going to change, which is greatly going to impact both the people and the spaces. So those are things that we need to pay attention to within movement. So this next piece is called diffusion, and it's a part of movement, and there's a lot of different interesting examples you could look at with the idea of diffusion. Again, I have other videos. Go check those out to look at some more specifics and some images and some elaborated examples. Just for our purposes, though, I'm just going to run through relatively briefly the different types of diffusion. Please note that this is kind of a technical term, the idea of diffusion. The idea is we're looking at the way that we can describe the spread of things throughout space. And so, it's again, kind of like the other sciences that you have classifications of things. In biology class, you have the various classifications of plants and animals. And in this, you're looking at, well, not just that it did spread, but what were the characteristics of that spread and how is that going to help me understand not only the thing, but then also the space itself. So just so that you're aware, when we talk about diffusion, there are two general categories, two big categories of diffusion. You have what's called relocation diffusion and expansion diffusion. So those are two different categories. And then within expansion diffusion, you have three different types: hierarchical, stimulus, and then contagious diffusion. And so we'll run through those relatively briefly. When we talk about relocation diffusion, and this is separate by itself, it describes a very specific type of movement. Basically what has to happen with relocation diffusion is that a person has to get up and move to a new space in order for whatever the characteristic is to move. The other types of diffusion we're talking about, ideas, concepts, cultures, technologies, spreading from person to person, information, news, from person to person. Relocation diffusion is a person physically gets up and then moves to a new space and takes the idea, the technology, the culture, whatever it is with them. Within expansion diffusion, that is describing the process of something happening very quickly. Well, I guess not necessarily relatively quickly, but it starts off small and then gets larger. They always talk about, in textbooks, it talks about this idea of the snowballing effect. The idea that you start off small and then over time it gets larger and larger and larger and more people begin to participate. So we characterize the diffusion in 3 different ways. First is hierarchical. Look at the root word. The idea is hierarchy. So this idea that we start at the top and then we filter down to the bottom. So it always starts with a node or person of influence or importance. So they come up with an idea, they like something, they promote something. Pop culture is really easy with this, especially kind of the older sense of pop culture. A celebrity likes something, and so therefore a lot of people start liking it afterwards. It's this trickling effect from the top to the next couple, then kind of down to the general masses. And really it's all based upon the person, the thing's influence or importance within society. Secondly is contagious diffusion. This essentially describes how quickly something spreads. Do not get contagious diffusion mixed up with an illness of some kind. Obviously, we talk about the idea of something being contagious because it spreads relatively quickly, but that's not necessarily always the case with contagious diffusion. The idea here is that you have something that's spreading through society, and it spreads quickly, and it really kind of spreads regardless of who you are, what your position in society is, how much money you have, those types of things. So it's just being adopted or adapted by large numbers of people in very short order. Okay, and the last one is stimulus diffusion. This is the one that's kind of the hardest for students to understand, mostly because I don't know that there are a lot of great examples of it. But the idea is that you have a concept, you have an idea, and then as it moves to a new space, you have some underlying principles that remain the same, but it gets tweaked a little bit for the new space. So one of the examples I like a lot is the idea of domestication. So domestication is a concept that's used for plants and animals, but as you go from space to space to space, different types of plants and animals are domesticated. And it's mostly because of the geography. Not all plants and animals are going to do well in every single place. So the concept itself has spread, but the animals that it applies to are different. So that's one of the examples I like for stimulus diffusion. Alright, so we're done with the 5 themes of geography, the 5 themes of spatial perspective, how it is that we go about studying space. And what you'll find is that as you go through the course, the idea is that we want to take those 5 themes and we want to apply them to the different units of study. So next we're moving on to maps. So maps really are the primary tool of geographers. And the whole idea is, like we talked about, we're trying to create spatial perspective. So the way that we do that is we take the data that we've collected and then we present it on the map, and we can do that in a variety of different ways. So before we can go on talking about how it is that we display data, there's a couple of ideas that are significant in terms of understanding maps, how to read maps and things like that. You need to understand this idea of scale. Now this could either be map scale or scale of inquiry, but the idea of map scale just helps us to understand to what extent is how much of the Earth's surface is being portrayed on the map. So you'll hear the idea of small scale and large scale. Try not to get too bogged down in the details. Just know that the smaller the scale, the more general the information is going to be. The bigger the area of the Earth that you're going to see on the map. The larger the scale, the more specific the detail is going to be, or the more specific the information is going to be, the more detailed the map will be. The other thing that you know is when you're talking about more general, you see kind of a broad picture. When you're seeing something very specific and narrow in scope, you're kind of losing the big picture and you're kind of honing in and focusing on a specific place. Okay. The other idea that we need to be familiar with are the notions of distortion and projection. Now these are really a product of trying to display three-dimensional surfaces on a two-dimensional surface. So the problem that always comes up when you're trying to put the Earth on a two-dimensional map. So that's what happens with distortions. You should talk about properties of maps and things like that. We're not necessarily here to do that. But each of the properties of the Earth will be distorted on the map because it's two-dimensional surface. The second term there is projection. So what happens is when you have the distortions that take place, those are done in a variety of ways to create the projection. The cartographer knows that the map will be distorted. Basically, he has to decide for himself what is the most acceptable types and levels of distortion that he's going to see. And so then that's what he's going to have on his map. And so we'll talk about a couple of different types of projections that you probably need to know for the test. So just so that you're aware, there are a lot of different types of projections. In fact, there's some interesting websites you can go to and you can look at a large variety. But really, for the purposes of human geography and for the test, I imagine that these four will probably be the most important for you, either to help you understand where maps come from or some of the ones that are more popular today. So you've got the Mercator projection, the Gall-Peters projection, the Robinson projection, the polar projection. So we'll start with the Mercator projection. This is the one in the upper left-hand corner there. This is really put out there because everybody likes to make fun of it. They like to make fun of it because what it does is it distorts land area. People use this to talk about a Eurocentric worldview, the United States and Europe trying to make itself larger than it really is. Africa's way too small, South America's way too small. So people use it to really to kind of deride Westerners and the maps that we've made. It was used so that Europeans can sail across the Atlantic Ocean, so, you know, that's just the way that it goes. But that's what you're going to see as an old school map. A lot of people don't like it anymore, and it's really not that big of a deal, but there it is. The next one in the upper right-hand corner, that is the Peters projection. Now, a lot of people like the Peters projection. There's a West Wing episode that deals with the Peters projection that you'll see and your teachers might show you. But the reason that people like it is it shows a more appropriate size. So you'll see that the land areas, the actual shape is skewed, but the land area proportionally in terms of size is kept relatively accurate. So people like it because it does all the things that Mercator project. It does what they feel like is right, whereas Mercator projection is wrong in those areas. That it creates a better sense of size and proportionality to help you understand how the land masses are really in comparison to one another. The one on the bottom left, that is the Robinson projection. This is used in a lot of publications, like National Geographic will use Robinson projection. Your textbook, a lot of times, for the most part, will use Robinson projection, mostly because it doesn't create terrible distortions of the major continents. Now, you'll still notice Antarctica down there at the very bottom is all very thin and pressed down at the bottom of the map. Nobody really cares because, you know, other than scientists and penguins, there's not a whole lot going on down there. But it creates a better representation of what the world actually looks like in that regard. The last one is a polar projection. Specifically, this is a north polar projection, and this is really good for understanding the ideas of development and the ideas of core periphery, semi-periphery. And so the reason that we have this one is because it's pretty specific to some of the concepts we talk about in class, and that's why I think it's significant to point it out here. So the only thing coming from a polar projection is the idea that you're actually looking down on the Earth from the North Pole. And so it's supposed to give you a different kind of perspective to help you to understand relationships between states, especially politically speaking, just to give you a little bit better understanding there. And you can really see how much closer some states are than we necessarily consider them to be based upon our normal understanding of the world. So those are the different types of projections. Again, there are others. But those four are the ones that I definitely think you should know. Okay, so now we're going to move on to the thematic maps. The thematic maps are really, if we're talking about different types of maps, these are really the most important types of maps you need to know for geography because it's really the way that geographers are able to display their data on the map. And so these are the different types of maps we can use in order to create spatial perspective. Now, oftentimes, the different types of thematic maps will use a type of map projection, but you don't necessarily need to know which projection it is in order to get the thematic map. So you see the five that we have there, the isoline, the choropleth, the dot density, proportional symbol, and the cartogram. So we'll go over each of those relatively briefly. So the first one we have here is what's called an isoline thematic map. Okay, so just think of it in these terms. It says isoline, so the word line is in it. Line is going to be a significant portion of isoline because what's happening with the isoline thematic map is that you are connecting the points of equal value along the line. And there are some different maps that do this. Probably one of the more popular ones that's used as isolines are topographical maps. So if you look at the topographical map that we have here, and if you're familiar with topographical maps, you know that elevation is what the line represents. And so along that line, it's going to be the exact same elevation all around. Now, the closeness of the lines, or how far they are, that tells us how steep the land is, and or what the pitch of the land is. But the lines themselves are the data that we're trying to represent on the isoline. So this next one is called a choropleth map, which is probably one that you're more familiar with, one that you've probably seen before. So basically all we're doing is, based upon the data we've collected, we're doing some shading, and each of the colors is going to represent a range of the data. So here we're looking at per pupil expenditures in North Carolina for education. Generally speaking, what's going to happen is the lighter the shade, the less the value, the higher the shade, the greater the value. So the idea here is it's supposed to show you pretty easily, and your eye is supposed to be able to catch it really easily, what's happening more often in a particular area on the map. This next one we have is what's called dot density. So really important that you don't get this one confused with proportional symbol map, because for whatever reason, my students oftentimes get this one confused with proportional symbol map. With dot density map, the way the data is displayed is by a dot, and that dot is the exact same size, and every single dot has or represents the exact same value. Okay, so the whole idea behind dot density map is to help us understand much more easily distribution. How often is something happening within a space? Okay, and where do we find it most likely in that space? And you can also talk about the density of something within that space, but it's supposed to give you a much better understanding of distribution across the space, where those things are happening at specifically. This next one is proportional symbol map, and I would think it's relatively self-evident what a proportional symbol map is, but not everybody may know. The idea is you have a symbol, doesn't matter what it is, and the smaller the symbol, the less of something is happening. The larger the symbol, the more that something is happening. So in this case, and this was kind of an interesting one because I've never seen one like this, but we have the state of Maryland divided up by counties, and it's the number of calves or cows. It says cattle and calves sold in Maryland in 1997. So the larger the cow, the more cows that have been sold. The smaller the cow, the fewer the cattle that have been sold. And so again, the idea is it's similar to a choropleth map. You're supposed to be able to catch your eye relatively easily where something is happening with greater frequency, and so therefore your eye is supposed to go in that direction. And then of course we can make some judgments. We can make we can come to some conclusions about the space, make some inferences about the space based upon the frequency at which something is happening in that particular space. The last type of map we're going to look at here is what's called the cartogram, and this tends to be the one that's most fun for for people because everything looks kind of wonky. Everything's out of shape because what's happening here with the cartogram is the size of the land area is supposed to represent the value of whatever is being presented on the map. So the reason that cartographers will do this is oftentimes we associate the size of something with level of importance or how often something is happening. So what cartographers are trying to do is help us to separate those notions. Just because something is large does not necessarily mean that a lot of something is happening in that space. And there's a lot of interesting maps out there. This one I just happen to have deals with population. So you'll notice, hopefully it helps if you're familiar with the general size of countries around the world. The idea is, again, to kind of catch your eye relatively easily and quickly in certain directions to notice which countries in the world are largest. And so, of course, that's represented by the landmass. Now, the other thing to do that's kind of interesting is to compare the size of things as they actually are with how they're represented on this map. So you look at something like Canada. Canada, is a relatively large country, relatively large landmass, but yet on this map is represented very small to help us understand that even though Canada itself is very large, population is not very large. Same thing with Russia. Russia is a very large country geographically speaking, largest country in the world in terms of land area, yet on this map it's represented relatively small. So it helps us to have a better understanding of what's happening in those spaces to disassociate the idea of size from either value or how often something is happening in that space. So there you go, guys. Again, a brief review of Unit 1. Hope you found that helpful. Again, just a very brief overview of those things. Certainly, if you have any questions, feel free to send me a message. Hope you guys do well on the tests. Thanks for watching, and as always, I hope to see you next time.